Okay, so first I want to start by saying that this will almost definitely be the dumbest video I'll ever make, or, if I get this right, the smartest video I'll ever make, but the chances are slim. I am fully prepared to be torn apart in the comment section because my theories will be rather outlandish, so do type away if you disagree. I'd like to break down my theory into 3 different sections. The first being some obvious no shit stuff. The second being the production of the film, the budget, the marketing, and why I think Nolan, of all people, would hide a sequel to one of his own films. And then the third section is the story and the characters and the effect that Tenet, being an Inception sequel, would have on those things. So let us begin. First off, some rather obvious things. Pretty much everyone on the internet who has seen the trailers for Tenet have said that out of all of Nolan's films, it feels most like Inception. A lot of my friends also say that it has very Inception-y vibes and feels like it could exist in the same world. So I'm not the only one who feels this way. And I think that anyone who has seen Inception, which by the way is my joint top favorite film of all time, so I know it pretty well, anyone with half a brain cell could probably see a number of similarities between the two, but I really want to elaborate and explore it further because I think some of it is rather interesting. Okay, so section 2. First things first, let's get some of the more stupid superstitions out of the way. Tenet is being released at the beginning of a new decade in 2020, well hopefully, just like Inception was in 2010. The posters are kind of similar, with one man in a suit standing in a fractured photo with a very similar color tone. Although to be fair, Interstellar has this as well. Most of Nolan's posters do kind of look the same. I'm not so certain about this next one, but I do believe that in the early teasers and trailers for Tenet, they use a font that is also used in the marketing for Inception and no other Nolan film whatsoever. So just Tenet and Inception. Tenet has been described by Nolan himself as his most ambitious undertaking, with a budget of $205 million. The film obviously looks very VFX heavy, with lots of practical stuff being done. The whole reversal of time was probably rather costly to execute with precision. However, I think it's fair to say that it's not that much more VFX heavy than Inception, which featured a lot of big sets and locations and epic scale sequences, similar in style of course to Tenet. Inception had a budget of $160 million. So why do I bring up the budget? Well, if we're in agreement that both films aren't that drastically different from one another in terms of how much it costs to actually make it, in terms of visual effects and sets and locations and all that. I mean, let me remind you that the rotating corridor was a set that was built to rotate in a controlled environment. This set had to be flooded. There were underwater sequences, snow fortresses, car chases, a train coming down a road. It's just about as expensive as a big music hall, or a reversing hallway fight, or a car chase with time manipulation, or a plane explosion. Common sense should dictate that that aspect of Tenet shouldn't really be $45 million more expensive than Inception. So where is all that cash going to? Well, my answer is the cast, and I don't mean the announced cast, because the actors that have been announced aren't exactly A-list Hollywood royalty. John David Washington and a pre-Batman Robert Pattinson are big names, but they're not Matthew McConaughey, they're not Christian Bale, and they're certainly not Leonardo DiCaprio. I think that the reason Tenet is so expensive is because the rest of that money may have gone to the salaries of the likes of DiCaprio, Joseph Gordon-Levitt, Tom Hardy, Ellen Page, and those guys. If you really compare this cast with Nolan's other films, it's unusually small, and there aren't nearly as many big-name stars. And of course you might be wondering, if Nolan actually had arguably the biggest movie star in the world in his film, why not put him in the marketing material and the posters and the like? My answer to that is very, very simple. This man right here, Matt Damon in Interstellar, is the biggest piece of evidence I could use to support my ludicrous theory. If you really think about it, Matt Damon is probably the biggest star in that film. but he was completely hidden from it, from the marketing, from everything, to maintain a real surprise. We had no idea he was in the film until we saw that scene. And that gives me confidence that Nolan would try and pull this off on a much bigger scale. Because that reveal in Interstellar was so well received, I think he's using the fact that he is Christopher Nolan and he is trusted and beloved by millions to draw in the audience and surprise them in the best way possible. The studio obviously has unwavering confidence in Nolan as a director. After all, he has made them a lot of money, and one may think, this is a new story, it's original, it's being pushed as the savior of movie theaters and films around the world. Is Nolan's name really enough? I'd say it is, but I think the studio is backing this movie for its July release so much because it's confident that word of mouth will spread if it does turn out to be an Inception sequel. And people will rush to see the sequel to one of their most financially successful films, which also happens to secretly star Leonardo DiCaprio. I mean, $205 million is no joke. Most studios in Hollywood wouldn't even give Scorsese $250 for his next film, which also stars DiCaprio and Robert De Niro. So you must think that Warner Brothers would also be concerned with the bankability of the actors and only give Nolan this much because they know that this guy will bring in the big bucks, but that this guy will also bring in the big bucks. So from a story point of view, how would Inception and Tenet be connected? That's part 3. Well, first things first, these are the only 2 Nolan films, excluding Interstellar, that take place in the future. There's often a running joke about how a lot of Nolan's characters often dress like Christopher Nolan, and with Robert Pattinson's character it's quite uncanny. The same thing can be said with Dom Cobb in Inception. I shall elaborate on this a little bit more, but first, the big hole that needs to be addressed is that Michael Caine is in both films. My theory is that Michael Caine plays the exact same character in both films, and that Tenet takes place around 25 to 30 years after the events of Inception. The real world of Inception, although it is in the near future, is very much the near future. But when you look at Tenet, it is also a grounded depiction of the future. There's no mention of interstellar space travel and all that. Everything seems to still take place on Earth, but there are 1 or 2 things that might show that Tenet is a few decades further than Inception. For one, look at Rob Pattinson's suit here, specifically the lapel of the jacket. This is something that really stuck out to me from the first time I saw it, because it's a shawl lapel, which in our world is typically seen on tuxes. It's not something you'd put on a jacket of this material, so there is some futuristic clothing, let's say, that wasn't on display in Inception. So why am I saying all this? Because I think that Michael Caine in Inception, who is the grandfather of these 2 kids, James and Philippa, I think that this is James and this is Philippa. Now, stay with me here. I talked earlier about how Pattinson looks a bit like DiCaprio in Inception, and in Tenet, he is a blonde. In real life, though, he very clearly has brown hair. This was a creative and intentional choice. He speaks with a British accent, which of course he got from being raised by his grandpa. Philippa, on the other hand, who is also a blonde, is played by a French actor and speaks with a French accent because her mother was also French. What furthers this even more is that they have not released the names of any of these characters on IMDb or any other platform, because the names would be a spoiler in and of itself. Another really dumb piece of evidence is that when they show some of the films that Nolan has directed in the latest trailer, Kenneth Branagh, who had only previously worked with Nolan on Dunkirk, was shown after Dunkirk, and Pattinson was shown after Inception. We also know that Himesh Patel will play a role in the film, and it seems as if Washington and Pattinson's characters go to him for help, just as Eames brings Cobb to his chemist, Yusuf, who does bear a resemblance to Patel. Maybe there is a connection there or not, but it's more likely due to the fact that a chunk of Tenet is supposed to take place in Mumbai, India. Now obviously the biggest thing that would come from Tenet being an Inception sequel in terms of story has nothing to do with Tenet, but the ending of Inception, because the existence of Tenet, the existence of an Inception sequel, would then answer the big question, which of course was, was Dom Cobb dreaming the whole time? Now, I think it's fair to say that he wasn't. There have been multiple pieces of evidence to support this, the biggest of which being Michael Caine, who has publicly said that Nolan told him that all the scenes that had Michael Caine take place in the real world. So where would Dom Cobb be in the world of Tenet? Would they have to kill him off screen or age him up? I think that the most interesting way of doing things in this context, in the context of the Tenet being an Inception sequel, is to still have him be dreaming and still stuck in limbo. The story could or would be that Kenneth Branagh's Russian character, who can supposedly communicate with the future, has in actuality found the secret to bringing the near unlimited time found in limbo into the real world. And that's how this whole time manipulation inversion thing works. It's a power that is drawn from the near endless time found in the world of limbo or something. Then Branagh is trying to take over the world or control it in some ways, and so those two worlds are colliding. The only people with enough time or knowledge or power to stop Branagh are the ones who have also been trapped in limbo themselves for decades. Washington and Pattinson are sent on a mission to find the OG Inception crew, who may be the last people on this planet aside from Branagh, with an extraction machine. Those guys have been in hiding and have hidden the real-world bodies of Cobb and Saito, but for some reason are perhaps unable or unwilling to go into limbo themselves, or maybe they've been killed off screen or something. So Cobb's son, James, and this new character, played by John David Washington, have to do so themselves. And so a lot of the scenes you see in the trailer are them trying to infiltrate potential locations of the final extraction machine, so they can go in and bring these guys out. Once again, it's just a theory, and it has a 0.01% chance of happening, so it goes without saying that you should definitely take this with multiple grains of salt. But if somehow something similar to this actually happens, well, you heard it here first.